Welcome to the 9th season of the Summer Solstice series at First Presbyterian Church, Salina. Hello, I'm Martha Ray, co-coordinator with Sydney Soderberg of the Summer Solstice series. In planning the 2020 programs, we knew that we couldn't ignore the current time of disruption and uncertainty. In the midst of so much confusion, we took the opportunity to bring together the best local and national minds in a virtual format to explore this year's theme, the edges of new community. Today is the second in the series, titled Possibilities and Hope, Hope in Possibilities. Panel members are Jerry Brown, former two-time governor of the state of California, Stan Cox, research fellow at the Land Institute and author of The Green New Deal and Beyond, and Kevin Wilmott, film professor at the University of Kansas and Oscar-winning filmmaker. The panel is moderated by Gerald Gillespie, emeritus professor of psychology at Kansas Wesleyan University. Please note that you as audience members are able to submit questions by email to communications@fpcsalina.org. That's communications@fpcsalina.org. These questions will be compiled for the final session on August 19th. And a reminder, Possibilities in Hope and Hope in Possibilities is by definition exploring stretchy thinking, moving into new territory that might just take us out of our comfort zones. We certainly don't ask you to agree with everything, and in fact, it's okay to really disagree, but please do listen. And as with all of our summer solstice programs, the views expressed by the participants are their own and not those of First Presbyterian Church. Finally, remember that this program can be viewed anytime at this site, and please invite others to join in. And now, Professor Gillespie.
My name is Gerald Gillespie. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you who are joining and watching this. It's our second program in our 2020 Solstice series entitled Edges of New Community. And in our first panel, we looked at the losses, the grief, the trauma resulting from this pandemic time. So today our theme for this panel is Possibilities in Hope and Hope in Possibilities. And we have a panel of very special presenters today, who I'm sure will challenge all of us to look a little bit more actively for those possibilities for change and for opportunities at a time when crises seem to be piling up and multiplying in many ways. So just before we begin, just a word on the format. I'm going to begin with a general question or two for each of the people here that we have in turn, so we can have some understanding of their perspectives on each of their themes. And I will ask some follow-on questions after that, but this is really intended as a dialogue and a conversation that we hope also engages you who are watching this. For you viewers, you're going to have your own questions. I hope we would encourage that, so you can email those to communications@fpcsalina.org, and we're going to be posting that email address up a little bit later. But we don't have time today to be dealing with in any way those particular questions. I'd like to welcome this distinguished group here and thank each of them for the time they've given to us. Our panelists are former two-time governor of California, Jerry Brown, research fellow in ecosphere studies at the Land Institute, Stan Cox, and Kevin Wilmott, an Oscar award-winning filmmaker and writer and professor at KU. I'd like to begin our discussion today with Stan, who has recently published a challenging and a timely book that is getting some growing attention in this time where national and world crises seem to be converging in some powerful ways. His book is The Green New Deal and Beyond. So Stan, I'd like to invite you in the few minutes you have to begin here to give some sort of synopsis of your research, your thinking, that have really centered around, in some ways, a central question we all have in this time, and that is, how can we get back to normal? And can we get back to normal? And what does normal mean in this time and going forward? You drilled down in your work on the problem of human beings facing up to limits, to real boundaries. So I'd like to ask you to discuss the nature of those limits and what you believe it takes from us in our communities actually to meet this new normal going forward. So thank you again, Stan, for participating.
Well, thanks, Jerry. And I'm pinching myself, having a chance to have a conversation with a couple of people whom I've admired very much over the years. And welcome to Salina, such as it is. I would start by saying that climate denial and the failure to act on the climate emergency has roots, I believe, in an attitude among the well-off that it's only others, that is, people of color in this country, impoverished people here and throughout the world, who are going to suffer the worst consequences of deadly waves, flooding, heat waves, etc. I think similar illogic lies behind the failure of many of our political leaders and their supporters to accept the reality of COVID-19 and the measures that need to be taken to prevent another few 100,000 deaths. They look at the higher COVID death rates among Black Americans, Indigenous people, immigrants, people without health insurance, people in nursing homes, and they see the virus as something that happens to other people. And they believe they can protect themselves and their way of life in the face of just about any geoclimatic or health catastrophe. So there's no need in their minds to deal with the problem. The one thing they can't tolerate is economic disruption. And now we have GDP shrinking 33%. And so now we're in panic mode. The pre-pandemic normal that political and business leaders are so eager to reestablish had a single aim, which was GDP growth, that is the accumulation of wealth. They're now willing to risk the lives of many, many more people in a misguided effort to restore that growth. That pre-pandemic growth only benefited people like them, people and companies at the top of the economic pyramid, and it was only achieved by exploiting those in the bottom half. And the consequences of that growth have been a global ecological emergency, most prominently what scientists are calling the transgression of planetary boundaries, including, of course, greenhouse emissions, soil and water degradation, biodiversity loss, and disruption of the Earth's nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. If we don't pull back behind those boundaries, the consequences, I'm afraid, are going to be the end of civilization as we know it. So if we're speaking of hope, that's my hope that won't happen. However, when we come out on the other side of the pandemic, returning to so-called business as usual, that is unrestrained growth, that's what's going to be the top priority for business and government. But we can't go back to that normal. The Green New Deal is being talked about as a way to restore growth in a way that's both green and just. And the Green New Deal is quite good on justice, but it has no means of reducing greenhouse emissions or addressing the other ecological consequences of unrestrained growth. We need more, or we'll get right back into the end of civilization trajectory. Rather than generating wealth for the minority, the economy needs to generate sufficiency for everyone. We need to ensure enough housing and essential goods and services are produced and that they're affordable and accessible to everyone. That'll require diverting material resources away from superfluous production aimed solely at generating wealth for the producer. Restoration of GDP growth after the pandemic isn't going to make our society more just and humane. What will improve the quality of life for millions of Americans is to cure our distortions of economic power and our cruelly high level of inequality. In other words, we can't have a bigger pie. We just need a smaller pie sliced more equitably.
Okay. You have a lot more, I know, but we can get into some of that a little bit later. Thank you, Stan. We are fortunate for a number of reasons to have Governor Brown with us in this time of slowdown, if not shutdown. Having led the state of California, a state whose economy, I went and looked that up, is like the 5th largest in the world, I believe, at this point. But a state that has often also focused our national attention for its efforts at needing to grapple with major climate change effects for many years. The fire situation is just one example out there. It's also a state where efforts to develop new governmental policies on a number of major issues has certainly caught the eye of other states. And at least for some is a kind of a measure of experimentation with various kinds of social change efforts. So now all the states here are in the midst of this pandemic and economic crisis and climate change disruption and so on, as Stan said. So I'd like to ask the governor to at least speak, if he could, to how he sees the major kind of needs in California, but I think they all are also the needs and priorities that we may need to look at more nationally and in other states. So in other words, where does your heart really lie now, Governor, in terms of the concerns you have about where states are going, where the national government's going, and so on? So it's your time to write your own platform for us, if you'd like, here. So welcome, and the time is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be speaking with the people in the Midwest, far from the shores of California, where we're currently experiencing some fires about 6 miles from where I am now. It's only about 300 or 400 acres, but it doesn't look too bad. They're dropping. I just saw a massive plane fly over. That was last evening, dropping chemical to retard the fire. So that's where we are here. But otherwise, it's a beautiful day out. I'm here at the ranch where my grandmother was born in 1878. And her father, my great-grandfather, came across the plains, leaving Missouri, St. Joe, Missouri, in 1852 and getting to Sacramento a little bit thereafter, and then finding his way up here to what we call Colusa County and operating a stagecoach stop, which was quite successful until the horses stopped coming by every day and we got automobiles. So that was a technological breakthrough that ended the viability of the Mountain House stagecoach stop. But the Mountain House still continues because I live here and I'm on the road, and I do greet visitors as they drive by. Anyway, speaking to your issue of how I see what's going on, what I see in California I see the rest of the country. You talked about hope and possibilities. The possibilities are endless, both for good and for evil. Humankind has developed the power now that actually human beings could end the human experiment. This evolutionary outcome of millions of years could be dealt a really lethal blow by just the power that we have through technology and through the blindness that human beings have always been prey to. So what is most difficult is even to talk about this. The framework that we've been conditioned to accept is what I would call news of the day. What's hot, what's tweeted, what's in the headlines, or what's on TV. And these are the quantum events that never stop. As someone said about history, it's one damn thing after another. And certainly that's true. Every day we see something. But in the face of these huge threats, the nuclear threat, which could really put an end to most of our civilization in a matter of hours and days, also the climate change and all the effect that that's having, this requires a type of thinking that is not congenial to the average person, to the society, or to our media that provides our means of communication. Apocalyptic thinking is what is needed. We have to be able, at least leading members of our community and society, have to be able to entertain the notion that huge, unexpected, surprising events can occur that can wipe us out. And therefore, wisdom and prudence and great care is needed. But for the most part, these big topics are not news. The current nuclear arms race, the United States commitment to between $1 trillion and $2 trillion just on nuclear weapons modernization, improvement, making more effective, more lethal, more flexible, just that is barely noticed in the mass media. It's whether it's the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC, ABC, Fox News even, it's not a topic. And yet it's an ever-present danger because of the risk of nuclear accident, which has happened. False alerts, miscalculation, software error, all these thousands and thousands of weapons are held in check by software that can fail, has failed, luckily not lethally, and then of course the human beings. Now, a good example of all this is the pandemic, the coronavirus. Now, we've been warned about pandemic, just like we're warned about the dangers of nuclear war, but most leaders didn't pay much attention. Our public health did not rise to the occasion, and even today, we're suffering. So we obviously, we have to look at what this means. First of all, it means we can be surprised. People went along, it wasn't too long ago, early March, people going to restaurants, going out to shows and what have you, not a problem. Yet it was a problem. And it's a problem. We're still arguing about how it all started, but the increase of human beings to the almost 8 billion that we now have, the increase of their technological prowess and activity, and the reaching into the animal kingdom, into nature, is bringing us in touch with dangerous viruses. Ebola was one, SARS, the earlier SARS epidemic, and now COVID-19. These are going to increasingly be the order of the day. And we need our institutions to devote minds, resources to dealing with this. Unfortunately, even today, we're not dealing properly. The president completely flubbed the ball. He's blaming China which admittedly for 5 weeks dissembled, did not tell the truth, did not share. But instead of learning from that, which ended, by the way, in January, our own president compounded it and dissembled and lied and evaded for 5 months. And even today, we don't have the testing capacity. We don't have proper quarantine facilities, and we don't have a system to pay those whose incomes have been destroyed or who have to quarantine without work. So even today, we have not understood or mastered this virus. As a matter of fact, scientists don't fully understand it at all. But we have a national government that could mobilize the manufacturing capability of America so millions of tests could occur, identify those who carry the virus, quarantine them for 2 weeks, and the darn thing would be over with. But we can't even do that. Now, the second strategy would be wear a mask. We're having trouble with that. Anyway, there's so much to talk about. I just want to lay that out, that apocalyptic thinking, being able to consider the big wipeout that seems almost obscene to even mention. We got to think about it because we have to avert it. And we avert it by wisdom, by collaboration, and by just pausing and opening our eyes.
Thank you. I really appreciate both of those key points. I'm sure we'll come back to those even further as we're going on here. So thank you very much. Let's make sure we get to our third panelist here, Kevin Wilmott. Besides being an Academy Award winner and acclaimed filmmaker, and by the way, he has all kinds of projects underway at the moment. So we should feel especially grateful for having this time with him now. Besides being a friend, I think Kevin is really an important and tireless and really prophetic voice for social justice. Increasingly so, I think, among a growing circle of followers here. He's a Kansas favorite son who speaks in a voice, and he speaks in film with a truth-telling that I don't think we can afford to ignore. So I'd like to begin with this, Kevin. The observation's been made by many that they see the Black Lives Matter movement as transitioning from what people saw before as perhaps a little bit more radical kind of movement, but now to really kind of a leader in getting the society to look at very carefully at justice and in all its forms. It's become a movement of justice, a just movement. It feels like, I could be wrong, but it feels like there is a deeper change underway here for many reasons. So I'd like to know how you see, as we're making this transition, and since we're talking about the edges of community, how you see the artist's role in such a critical transition time, and how you see that and your work as shaping new cultural possibilities and institutional kind of changes that we need toward justice, resilience, sustainability, and so on. Thank you again for being here.
Sure. Thank you, Jerry. Always good to be with you, and a real honor to be with Governor Brown and Stan. You know, it's a unique time right now, and you know, I have to say that I think we're kind of living in the third act of my film, CSA, the Confederate States of America. And in the third act of that film, the climax of the film, we have a desperate man a desperate politician who's running for president, who's trying to hold on to the messages of the Confederate States of America. And literally, we're seeing that before our eyes right now. And you know, this whole kind of unique, I have to say, insane kind of time that's happened with the pandemic and having a racist president, and you all of those things converging at once has created a really kind of unique moment in American history. And in a sense of hope, I think there's, been an amazing kind of spring of hope that's come out of all this. And I think specifically with the Black Lives Matter movement, the lynching of George Floyd, the public lynching of him, I think this shocked the nation to its core. And Black people have been, and others have been, pleading with Americans for generation and generation and generation to understand that the police murder us. And a lot of people understood, but most people didn't. And most people were kind of sympathetic, but didn't totally believe it. I don't think. Or they kind of felt that, well, there's always some justification to it in some way. I think the public lynching of George Floyd just kind of erased a lot of that doubt for a lot of people. And it made folks move forward with their understanding of what poor folks and African Americans and Latinos and all the folks who have been the subject of abuse have gone through for years and years and years. And that's a huge step forward for America. I mean, that's just a huge step forward. For Black Lives Matter to go from one moment, this kind of, sideline organization that has a kind of small following, to being embraced by corporate America. I mean, when you see commercials on TV and corporations celebrating Black Lives Matter, something has changed. And I would say that George Floyd's death is kind of it's one of those iconic images that sadly and tragically so, but in the same vein of the fire hoses at Birmingham and the police dogs at Birmingham during the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, it is one of those iconic images that has moved people from kind of seeing things one way and now they see them another way. And it's tragic that it takes the loss of life, to achieve that. But I mean, that's unfortunately kind of the cycle we live in America, that we don't operate out of, insight and learning from our past and understanding what's going on in the world. We have to kind of be shocked. It's like Gil Scott-Heron always said, America leads the world in shocks, And so that in a sense, I think is a really optimistic, positive change. And the question now is going to be, can we build upon it? And I think it really ties into what Governor Brown and what Stan was saying, that we're living in this kind of apocalyptic time, and very similar to a bad science fiction film. And in those films, there are always the scientists that tell you, this is what's coming, and we need to prepare right now, and we need to do X, Y, and Z, and that character is typically the hero of the film, and the smart people in the movie will listen to that character, and the people that perish are the people that say, nah, that's dumb. I'm not going to wear a mask. I'm not going to, we don't have to worry about that meteor flying toward Earth. We don't have to worry about global warming, all of those things. And I mean, it literally, we're just living in this film that we all know so well as Americans. And we know the outcome. We know how this film ends, if you don't do the right thing. And so, I mean, it's just kind of an amazing moment right now, because things that have always been kind of buried in American life, things that have always kind of been put aside, are now so clearly apparent, and they're on the forefront, and we cannot avoid them and deny them and escape them anymore. The pandemic, if we learn from it, will be this thing that Stan had talked about, that will hopefully make us understand we got a lot of work to do real fast. And the Black Lives Matter moment, very much the same way, that if we take this moment and build upon it and move forward, that we can get rid of some of the last vestiges of institutional racism and all the different aspects of how racism is just embedded in our system. And I have a new film that's coming out soon about the Houston riot of 1917. And here it is 103 years ago, one bad policeman can destroy a city and cause major havoc to a nation. And 103 years later, here we are, experience that same story again, and so we've been in this cycle for a long time, and hopefully we can learn from it.
Mm-hmm. You bring up, it just strikes me that, and both you and the governor have sort of implied this, that the challenge is really to this new focus the society's looking at is the effectiveness of our institutions to actually deal with things like racism that's embedded in deeper patterns of how we interact and relate to each other. So let me start with Kevin to continue here, and then go back to the governor. Can you give us some understanding from your own perspective, Kevin, about that interrelatedness of institutional racism with things like wealth inequality, living wages, inadequate health care, critical safety net supports, and so on? Can you just expand on that? And then I'd like to go to the governor and then get all of you involved with some of that conversation too.
Sure. Well, I think everyday life in America, the way we all live every day, if you're born, on the other side of the tracks, as we always have called it, if you're born on that other side of the tracks and you're kind of born with one hand tied behind your back in a sense, then it just starts from there, and all the institutions that are designed to really kind of support you and to be a part of your life as a positive end up kind of either being used against you or just not really serving you in the way that they're supposed to be designed. And it just goes through every aspect of what you're talking about: wages, education, healthcare. It just goes all down the line, and all of those things affect you in all these various ways, and you end up just not being able to kind of, if you're lucky, you can kind of find a way to supersede it and grow out of it and find a way to survive it and to move forward. But if you're not lucky, and so much of it is luck, I would argue, so much of it is luck. That if you don't find a mentor, and if you don't find someone that gives you a break, and if you don't stumble on an education, and if you don't have something that gives you a chance, you're gonna be in this, you're gonna be part of the other America, and that other America has just been, this has been the bane of our life in this country since the founding. And it takes on many forms, and now we have the form it's in now, and that is, Brown has been fighting against his whole career. This is what Stan's fighting. This is what I'm fighting against. This has been the thing, that is so hard to kind of totally grasp, because it has so many different tentacles, and it has so many ways of holding people down. Women go through it a certain way. minority folks go through a certain way. Gay folks, transgender folks go through it in a certain way. I mean, it is so many ways that it affects folks' lives. And so much of the problem, I think, is that, we refuse to even identify it. We refuse to acknowledge it so much of the time. And you can't really defeat something or address something if it's not even acknowledged. I mean, that's a huge, I mean, that seems so simple, but it's a big part of the failure, I think, of moving forward on so many of these issues.
Mm-hmm. Governor Brown, are our institutions really up to these challenges? As I look out on education and the challenges now with the pandemic, you look at the institutional racism, all the tentacles there. I think a lot of people are wondering, can we deal with the scope of the challenge? And the nuclear issue you mentioned is just huge. It's been an ongoing concern of mine for decades here. Are we up to the challenges? Are there some changes that you might see out there, or changes that you think need to be implemented in some beginning ways now? Can you just speak to that generally?
But we're up to the challenge in the sense that the challenge has not overwhelmed us yet. So we're still in a state of possibility. But we have to, I think Kevin said something pretty good. Luck. There's a lot of luck here. Luck. Luck. I'm sitting here on a ranch where my grandmother was born. Luckily, the family kept it in various forms, and I ended up getting a piece of it. So that's luck for me. Luck that we haven't had a nuclear war yet. And part of this luck thing is it's not in our control. There are big social forces of which we are embedded in. And when we take the United States of America, we have, I don't know whether the word is a tale of two cities, this great country, but it's embedded in darkness as well. I mean, when I think of my great-grandfather coming across the plains and coming out here to this so-called virgin land, no, the native peoples who've been here for over 10,000 years had to be removed in massive killings, not just by the disease of the Europeans, but there were murders in California. In fact, some thoughtful people have called it genocide, according to that legal term. And then you start this experiment with genocide, or at least taking by violence the land of another, which there's no moral justification for, but here we are. We're not going to go backwards. And then certainly slavery was right along with it. So slavery was part of the essence of who we are. And I think we have to be careful how we look at the past, because we are the product of the past. And yes, George Washington owned slaves, but he still had traits that we very much admire. And we are that. And the third pillar of the dark side, we took half of Mexico in a war we made a pretext. So that's one hell of a legacy to start with. Genocide, massive slavery, and stealing half the country of your neighbor. So, but having said all that, America has all these great opportunities. It's done wonderful things. And so how we keep the balance between the good and the bad, that I think takes real vision and real clarity. But even today, I have to say, and I don't want to say we're running down, because I'm up with America, I'm positive, but I have to keep in my mind's eye the same thing. And I think we're talking now, a lot of people are talking about how bad the Russians are. And yet there's a lot of thuggery there and killings, bad. Ukraine, 13,000 people died. But America supported the war against the Nicaraguans, and 30,000 people were killed. And we go back and look at Vietnam, even though President H.W. Bush said we had kicked the Vietnam syndrome. Well, now what does that mean? Over 2 million people were killed. Human beings were killed by our bombs, fire, bullets, shrapnel, ripping people to shreds. 2 million people. And it was based, if you take the Tonkin Growth Resolution, that was, if not a lie, it was a gross distortion, which is the basis of our bombing campaigns. So I just like to put the dark side. And then you get the plight of Black Americans, the Jim Crow and where we are today and how the police are. So look, reform the police. I think there's a lot we can do, although I have to caution, in Oakland, when I was mayor, I signed a consent decree to bring in the federal oversight, and that consent decree is still operating, and they haven't been able to satisfy the federal judge that the police force meets the relevant constitutional standards. So you can make progress, but it's not going to happen overnight. We are embedded in this world. This is who we are. And by the way, if we look at China, or we look at Russia, or we look at England, I was just reading last night in the book, England in the 19th century executed 1,100 people a day. This was by a German author. He said Germany was only condemning 30 people a day. And so England was a lot more barbaric. I just raised the point that humankind has a dark side. And I was raised in a very traditional Catholic upbringing. I went to the seminary for 4 years. Original sin, the mind, the will is weak, the intellect is inclined to darkness, and we have a propensity to sin. Well, there it is. But let's deal with the inequalities. And by the way, getting rid of the poverty, and it's not going to be easy because the whole economic system is wired based on globalization, based on technology, based on reward for individual effort, so-called. And that has produced the mounting inequality. Even from where we are, 4 miles down the road here, I've seen farm workers, 95-degree heat. Now, in California, we do have a $13 minimum wage, which the farmers fought. That's good. But I'll tell you, when it's not heat out here, I want to be in air conditioning. I want to be out there bending over for $13 or even $30 an hour. So there's a lot of differences, inequities, and we need courage, we need imagination, we need wisdom. And I have to say, you ask about our system. The politics is based on messaging, manipulation, money. It's pretty impaired. I've been in this system, so I'm not going to tell you all my sins, but it ain't pretty. Let me tell you, it ain't pretty. On the other hand, if you see what China's doing, suppressing the Uyghurs and suppressing all the sin, it has a lot of good to it. There's a lot to be proud of. And the great challenge is, how do you be proud and appreciate the good while recognizing the evil and improving and making progress? This takes, I'd almost have to harken back to my seminary days. This is going to take faith and grace, meditation, and mortification. By the way, we're not going to get that from the political class. That you can take to the bank.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to make sure Stan gets into this conversation because Stan is able to link together and see all these interrelationships to climate change. But you've also spent some time thinking about how overwhelming it is for human beings to face up to the larger limitations imposed just by the environment we're living in, the physical, biological limitations. So could you speak a little bit, I know you've written about social mechanisms that we could at least think about, entertain. Maybe we're forced to begin to add to our plate here. But you may want to respond to what you've heard from Kevin and the governor as well. So feel free.
Yes. Well, I agree with you, Kevin, that the groundswell that we've seen over the past couple of months could really open people's eyes to the fact that we're not powerless and that things, long-standing problems can change. In your film CSA, the thing that struck me about it was you're seeing 21st century America, 140 Confederate States of America, 140 years after the South won the Civil War. And watching it, I was saying, well, this isn't all that different from early 21st century America that we actually had at the time. And so I think that maybe what we're seeing now, that America finally can change with regard to systemic racism, and not only on that issue, we've been increasing the emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases since around the time of the Civil War. So it's also a very long-standing problem, and I'm hoping that and I think the climate movement, climate justice movement, are taking heart in what's happening with Black Lives Matter and that whole movement. And maybe I'm naive, but I think we're learning something from the pandemic too that can lead to change in our ecological overshoot. We've recognized, for example, that an emergency requires extraordinary measures, even measures that disrupt everyday life. This spring and summer, we've seen countries take such extraordinary measures, departing from business as usual in a huge way because they had no other rational option. Unfortunately, in this country, we didn't go with the rational option, and we're paying the price now. But when you look at polls, people really think that that's what we should have done, is to take extraordinary action. And that difference between what happened elsewhere and what happened here has become clearly obvious to significant majority of Americans. And along with the reawakening regarding racial justice, I hope this realization will energize the already growing movement for broader change. Excuse me. And waking up Americans to the extraordinary measures that we're going to have to take to head off ecological meltdown. It's possible. This spring we saw people quit flying almost completely, and the world didn't end. The whole economic collapse happened in a chaotic way, but with an organized addressing of climate and other issues, we can pull back from those boundaries much more in a much more humane and organized way. One thing the pandemic has done, which I've never seen before, is that we've had a national discussion about what are essential goods and services and what are non-essential. And that's, we're going to have to make those choices in a broader way. So I hope that will provide the seeds of a national conversation about what we, with the more limited resources we're going to have to be using, what we can afford to, what we have to produce because it's essential to people's lives. What goods and services would be nice to produce if we have enough resources, and how we can allocate to those, and then what we should not be producing at all. I would argue, along with others, that we should we should be seeing the end of the cruise industry, because it's an ecological nightmare, and now it's a public health nightmare, and it is not worth it. It's a totally unnecessary thing. But that's just one one small example. So as we're coming out of the other side of the pandemic, whenever that happens, and it's looking more and more like it's going to be quite a while, but many on the left and center are looking at the Green New Deal as a clean economic stimulus that can help get us out of the economic predicament we're in by creating millions of jobs while building up renewable energy capacity and green infrastructure. That's a better way of creating new jobs than building more SUVs and hot tubs. But that in itself is not going to head off ecological catastrophe. From what we know, and all we know about the Green New Deal is the joint congressional resolution that came out last year, and it has the green part and the New Deal part. The New Deal part, which was written obviously before the pandemic, is pretty good. It has a lot of provisions, and it's just a resolution, so it doesn't actually create these things, but it calls for workers' rights and social safety nets, universal health care, racial justice, and all mostly really good stuff. It's the green part that's deficient, and because it has no provision for eliminating greenhouse emissions, which is supposedly the intent of the whole Green New Deal to begin with. It lacks a direct mechanism, for example, for driving the extraction and burning of fossil fuels down to zero within the required time frame, whether it's the IPCC, the world's climate experts, or the UN emissions gap report. We're going to have a 5 to 10% decline in the quantity of fossil fuels at every.
I might interject here that no state has a plan to get to zero yet.
Right.
The state of California has a goal of 2045 of getting to net zero emissions, but how we get there is not specified yet anywhere that I know of. And those steps not only are not spelled out in the Green New Deal, they're not spelled out too many places because it implies such a reconfiguring, a restructuring of our economy that there's no appetite or political way to do that quite yet. So what's required is something we do in California. We call it a scoping plan, and we lay out every couple of years what are the exact steps in regards of zero emission cars, zero emission housing, or reducing carbon emissions there, manufacturing, carbon pricing, going from gas or coal to renewable energy. So we have a very specific roadmap, and that roadmap is not adequate, but it's the best one in the United States, the best one in Western America. So I just want to outline the Green New Deal has issues, but everything is issues. And so we got to figure out very clear mechanical steps, and then we got to tie that in with Black Lives Matter and social justice. Wow. We got a lot of stuff to do here. So I don't know, Kevin, if you got any thoughts on that, but we're up against it.
I love what you guys are saying, because I think we got this unique moment where because the pandemic, I think one thing that happened because of the pandemic, people are paying attention that, people that weren't paying attention before are paying attention now. And that's the thing that I think has made the Black Lives Matter movement move forward. Because when people saw George Floyd and that shock that that happened because of that. We have to build upon that. We've got to build upon the fact that we've got their attention now. You know, people are at home and they're watching television and they're watching the news. You know, people don't watch the news when in normal time. And so, you know, things like that we've got to now that we've got their attention, we've got to educate them about these things we're talking about, and they've got to kind of we've got to make sure, hopefully the Democrats, the left, whoever, you know, can take advantage of this moment, because typically what happens is, I think we all kind of know that, you know, you get this moment and then it closes back up real fast. And we've got to make sure we get in this hole before it closes up. And we only have a certain amount of time. People are only going to pay attention so long. But I think that we've got their attention right now, and we need to expand what we're talking about. You know, Black Lives Matter, you know, is important because the right wing guys, the racist people say, well, no, all lives matter. Well, of course, all lives matter. That's a given. But the other things we're talking about, you know, is another example of how all lives matter. But if you don't get the policeman's foot off my neck, I'm not gonna, you know, that policeman's foot is not on everyone's neck; it's on my neck. But the environment is that foot is on all of our necks, and the nuclear button is on all of our necks. And so we've got to get people to understand that all these things are connected, and to try to take advantage of this moment.
No, I agree, Kevin, and I'm hoping that this opening that has been created will also shake up the leaders of the climate movement and the Green New Dealers, who, now, because of what Governor Brown was talking about, the political resistance to real change, have been, what I wrote was that they were in what you might call soft climate denial, to be very much, very much aware and talking about the reality of climate change and the terrible things that could happen, but kind of pulling their punches when they're talking about the very deep changes and alteration of the American way of life that's going to be necessary to do something about it, including the total elimination of fossil fuels. But I think the idea has been, okay, we'll get people coming along on this, and then eventually they'll see that we've got to go farther. But I think we have to be very plain with people from the very beginning that this is going to take, it's going to require sacrifice from those who can afford to sacrifice, and it's at the same time going to have to ensure that we all have what we need, including people who at this point don't have what they need. But people have told me, well, I sound like a presidential candidate, but I have a plan, and you can read my book and see my plan. But it's they say, well, good luck getting that through Congress, or good luck getting broad support. But I'm hoping in this time when we have so many emergencies coming at once that we'll get more accustomed to taking bolder action.
Well, I think it's clear we're all being forced to at least begin to think differently. The press of the issues, I think, on everyone is testing our mettle as characters. I guess one final question before we're going to leave here is, so can democracy, is that going to rise to the occasion, or is it a problematic question right now? Where is democracy in all of this? Because I think we know there's really that balance between the influence and the power that comes from the bottom up and then needs to make important fundamental decisions down from the top. So maybe the governor can speak into that at this point and see where everybody else is on that.
Well, where democracy is in America is where it is. Trump is president. The Senate's controlled by Republicans that just want to put in a bunch of right-wing judges and don't want to can't collaborate with the Democrats because their so-called base won't let them. At least that's what Mitch McConnell thinks. And then you have the Democrats, I think, are doing a pretty good job under Nancy Pelosi. And then we got an election. And I think it's relatively close. I think it's very hard to tell whether Trump is going to be able to exploit some of these protests in a way that Nixon did in 1968. Or even that Reagan did after the Watts riots and the Berkeley student protests and uprisings and sit-ins in his campaign for governor in 1966, when he was successful in beating my father, who was running at that time as incumbent governor. So look, it's not clear where we're going, but the nature of politics, already Trump has spent $1 billion. And I'm sure Biden's going to come up with his $1 billion. So there's a lot of money coming in through the internet from small donors. There's activism through Black Lives Matter, through other enthusiasms. But the big institute, it's not stable. Today, before getting on the show, I read the farewell address of Dwight Eisenhower. And I would recommend that to people. He's talking about balance, talk about the military-industrial complex, but the tone is of an American politics that doesn't exist at this point. So our hope is, quite frankly, if you want me to lay it right out to you, Biden wins, big landslide, the Democrats take over the Senate, Biden's plans for his New Deal, for racial equity, for income support, for better trade policies, for dealing with the COVID, for fixing up our health insurance, he can get enough of that done without a backlash or without losing heart because the inertia sets in. I think that's a big if, but that's the only chance we have going forward. And hopefully the Americans can take a lot more realistic view on our 700 military bases in the world and our thousands of nuclear warheads. I think we've got to deal with China and Russia and North Korea and Iran. Hopefully, Biden will restore the Iran deal, if Iran will even do it. So things are deeply screwed up. Let's be clear. And the politics is money, messaging, and manipulation. But Biden is a decent guy, an experienced guy, someone who knows the ways of Washington. But he will succeed or fail based on the crowd, the people around him in Congress, the media, the Fortune 500, and the active participation of citizenry. It's a big, complicated mix. Nobody is really in charge. Everybody has their little piece. Some have a little more than others. So I'd say, since we're talking at a Presbyterian-sponsored event, I'd say pray.
Yeah, well, we're certainly going to do that. We're getting close to closing, and I'm just thinking I would love to be able to sit down with these three and have extended conversation. This has been very helpful and very challenging, I think, for all of us who are watching this. So I want to formally thank you before we close. And I want to remind the viewers that you can email us questions that might have come out of this viewing and email those discussions once again to communications@fpcsalina.org. And we're going to be looking at some of those questions at our final panel, which will be on August 19th. And that final panel is entitled, "Are We Listening Now?" Well, there's a lot to take in today and with our first panel. So that's going to be the theme. Can we bring this home and make those changes in our communities and in ourselves? And again, this is going to be on August 19th, and our panelists then will be former Kansas Governor and Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius; Wes Jackson, Emeritus President and co-founder of the Land Institute; Burdette Loomis, Emeritus Professor of Political Science at the University of Kansas; and Maureen Morrison, who is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Wichita, Kansas. So in closing, on behalf of the First Presbyterian Church in Salina and the Solstice Series organizers, I want to thank each one of you panelists today for participation and for your contributions, past, present, and future, toward building a just and peaceful world. And let's leave with at least some measure of hope, I hope. So thank you all once again. I really appreciate this time.
Thank you.
Thank you. We need hope, but there's two other virtues:
Yeah,
hope, faith, and charity.
that's right. I should have mentioned that, but
Faith.
we'll edit that in. We'll edit those comments in.
All right.